Okay, first anecdote about George. We did overlap at NYU. Like, he finished 2 years after me. And so what I remember about George is, like, we were all in a big room with cubicles with no windows, the way it should be when you're a PhD student. Like, towards the end you would teach a class, and I remember he'd have office hours, and students would come in and ask a question, and then 5 minutes later another student would come in and ask the same exact question. And for me, that like kills brain cells. Like, having to say the same thing over again 5 minutes after I just said it, I just want to slap those people. And so, like, George had the most patience. He would just be like, that is a good question. He would be so patient with them and so kind, and I'd be like, man, George is a better person than I am.
It's known as sugar.
Yeah. Okay, so Daniel Kahneman, Kahneman Tversky, the psychologist that did behavioral economics, he has this idea or this notion of the experiencing self and the remembering self. Have you heard about this before? So, like, the experiencing self is how we are right now. Are we hot or cold? Are we in pain? Are we stressed? And the remembering self is like the more reflective when we think about where we are in our life and stuff like that. And so, like, how do they separate these things? Well, they do experiments, of course, because they're psychologists. But one of them is a little weird. It's like in a colonoscopy. You know, a colonoscopy is like an unpleasant experience. And the experiment that they did is where they just give you like, it's really unpleasant. And when it's over, you're just like, that was unpleasant. But so they did this experiment where after they finish the colonoscopy, they just leave the thing in there for a while, but they don't wiggle it around. And that is not as bad as when they're wiggling it around. And so those people feel better about the colonoscopy. So the fact that it's longer, but it doesn't feel as bad to them because they emphasize the beginning and the end is not as bad as it was when it was shorter. And so this, because your remembering self is different than your experiencing self, and you sort of store these things away. And so why do I bring that up? For the same reason. So it's not because the job market is like a colonoscopy. It's more that the experience of being a professor, our experiencing self is mainly not so different than if we worked at a hedge fund or insurance company or something like that. But our remembering self is much happier to be a finance professor for a lot of the reasons that George was saying. So I have some. This is the long. So this is just why I think that this profession is great. This is our remembering self, remembering how great being a professor is. And this George says this exactly. We get to do research that interests us. We get to study whatever we want. Like, if you work at a hedge fund, it's always returns on the left-hand side. But we get to explore whatever fancies us. For example, if you want to study explorations to the Arctic in the 1800s, you can do that. John Karpov has a paper in JPE where he does exactly that. So we can just sort of, the sky's the limit on the kind of things that we want to do, and that makes our job so much neater than just about every other kind of job. So, but I do encourage you to do the intersection between the stuff that you find interesting and that other people find interesting. And so hopefully there's some of that works. We get to interact with interesting people. Like, I love so much the different perspectives and backgrounds of my colleagues at Emory. It just makes this, like, when I think about like what other jobs are like it's so much worse than this job. It's so fun to be where we are, to be an academic and be so other people in the university. It's really nice. It's respected. It sounds good to people. Like, I was driving carpool for one of my kids, and there was a fourth grader in the car. And I was talking to this fourth grader about and she said, well, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm a professor at Emory. And she was like, oh, I like that it sounded good to a fourth grader what my job is. So that's a nice thing. And maybe it's not as romantic as the asterisks are for me, remember the stories I'm supposed to tell. That was the carpool story right there. And so maybe our like, when I say finance, it doesn't sound quite as good as something more romantic in the humanities. But then we have the next word, which is pay. Our pay is nice. We have the ability to live comfortably in just about every city in the country. Unfortunately, San Diego is not one of those cities, so I'm sorry about that. Maybe Seattle isn't either. But, and we have flexibility, of course, to sort of work when we want, from where we want. So it's a good job. Okay. So that's the page. Okay. So it's a great job. However, sometimes positive affirmation can be, seem rare. So we're critical of each other. And so I would say, George listed our sort of outcomes we want to happen, like have a great job market paper, get a good job, get tenure, get promoted. But it's also nice to just try to focus on the process of doing the research and enjoy that process and not dwell so much on the outcome of what it's going to be. Like when we're doing the statistics, when we're having the, I'd say part of the funnest part of the job is having an idea and then finding the initial results to see if they support that ad. That is so much fun. And so like, don't worry so much about, oh, it's only good if it gets in a good journal. Enjoy the moment. Enjoy interacting with your colleagues and telling them about going to conferences and talking about research. To me, it's just a fun part of the process, even if it doesn't work out. Like, I would like to tell you about one of my, I'm not gonna do it right now, but I would like to tell you about one of my failed projects that I thought was really fun to work on. And so, even if it doesn't work, it can be fun to talk. Okay, try to develop a thick skin. It's, for me, I got this in junior high when I played football. It was nice because the coach would just yell at us all the time, and I did not have many adults in my life. I was a pretty good kid, so my parents didn't yell at me a lot. And so having this adult just yell at me, I was like, why is this person doing that to me? And so, but you get used to it over time, and the same thing applies to rejections and criticisms that people give. Eventually you're just like, okay, it's not really personal, it's not personal, it's just the way it is, and you sort of don't dwell on these things. And so rejections do hurt. This asterisk, I have this paper on, it's on Glassdoor, this website that has company reviews, and we sort of got that data and sort of linked it to firm performance. But this is related to some Alex Edmonds work. So when we had our first draft, I sent it to Alex Edmonds, and he was really friendly about it. You know, he's the editor of Review of Finance now, and he's really busy, but he took the time to send us some comments. And so he sent me a couple of emails along the way. And so when it was forthcoming to JFE, he sent me a nice email that said, oh, you know, congrats, I saw that it was forthcoming. I wasn't the referee, is what he said. But I said, well, hey, I'm going to this EFA, hope to see you there. And he told me this anecdote. So he said, yes, I'm going to the EFA. It's the first one I've been to in a long time because my papers had not gotten in. He said one time he and his co-authors submitted 11 papers to the European Finance Association, and they went 0 for 11. And so this is the guy who's now the editor of Review of Finance. And so rejections happen. So I think he has a thick skin. He didn't dwell on, but he remembered it. He didn't dwell on it, and you sort of just move on and realize, hey, these things are noisy. You don't have to sort of worry too much. Okay, so celebrate successes, R&Rs, you know, I think oftentimes it just feels more like relief because there's still this chance it can be rejected, but go ahead and feel good about the 60% chance your paper will get in, or sort of whatever you think it is, depending on how the level is. Invitations to give talks, I think those are some of the warmest fuzzies we have because we haven't submitted to anything. So like when people just send you an email and say, would you come give a talk? Those are some, I think you should just take the day off and be like, oh, it was a really nice thing. That's sort of like the best one. Okay, and thank those that, a nice note from students. This is one of my undergrad students who took my Finance 101 class is now a professor at Baruch. And that was a really nice thing. We talked about research. He's a co-author of mine in one of my projects. And the fact that he chose a career in academics, it's really satisfying that I've ruined this person in this way. So thank those this will make you think of him, because he sends me all kinds of gift baskets all the time. It's really nice. Like when he got into a PhD program, when he got a job, he's a nice guy. And so it made me think early on when I started receiving thank you notes from students, it made me think, well, I should thank the professors in my life who have been, kind to me. And I found that one of the professors that spent a lot of time with me when I was undergrad, and I tried to track him down, he passed away. So he passed away sort of on the young side. So don't wait. Thank these people that have been kind to you, because it's a good thing. Okay, so setting a research agenda. It's nice to have a well-defined research agenda. Try to choose research where the results are interesting and important regardless of what you find. Choose impactful research. Be known for a research area. None of this has ever worked for me. I've not really been able to do this very well. And so this can be aspirational, but it's okay if this does not work. If you do not have a neat category for your research, it's all right. What the profession wants is thoughtful, careful research where we can conclude something and rule out alternative stories. It's okay if it doesn't sort of fit together in a broad narrative around. So that's why I was Joey was saying he has several papers that focus on one thing, and I was like, the elusive research agenda. So some people are able to do it. It's okay if you are. As long as sort of each paper you have is good, it stands by itself, that's okay. So if you, one thing that you can do if you have an idea for a paper where you're not yet an expert, then you can sort of seek out someone who is an expert in that area. And so I have a paper with Hong Lin, who was here, and with Vikas at Georgia State, I had a hedge fund idea, and I'd never written a paper on hedge funds before, but I knew Vikas at Georgia State has many, many papers on hedge funds. So at first I was like, hey, I can just talk to a PhD student, and we can get the data and clean it up and try to work on this. But I was like, you know what, this will just be much better. He will know all the issues that we need to think about, and he will have the data sets ready to go. So I just called him, and like 6 weeks later, we had this paper with Hong Lin. And Vikas was like, oh, I have a student who knows everything. And she did. And so it was really easy to have that paper long. So if you're not yet an expert, then seek out someone who is, and that makes the process a lot smoother. But one thing that you can do then, in that context, is like, so when students say, well, how do I, if I have 2 papers and people ask me who I am, just know them both really well. If you own them both, if you know everything about the paper, then people will give you credit for that stuff. Then it's like a bonus. It's like, this person knows everything about this literature, and they know everything about this literature too. I can talk to them, you're sort of interesting to a broader group of people. But if you just want to say, I'm mainly this, and only ran the tables on that, then that doesn't sound as good. You don't have to choose. Just know your papers well. You get credit for it, the more you know it. And this is true to a certain extent, even if you work with senior people. So if they don't know you, then you're not going to get as much credit if you work with someone senior. But if they see you present, and they're like, that person knows everything about that paper, they know how to motivate it, they know how it fits in, then you get more credit for it than if you're not able to do that. So that's sort of something. Okay. So this is sort of related to the how to have ideas thing. And I say, like, for mere mortals, I say think inside the box. So this is a read paper. So I used to think I would get ideas from reading the Wall Street Journal and Fortune and things like that. And maybe I got one idea out of that in 20 years. Usually it just comes from reading papers. And so it's nice that they can be from further afield, but even just reading finance papers and say, I can use this portable idea notion. I'm sort of echoing that. I can apply this we read in this paper and something in another context. And so I have one paper that looks at like company name fluency, and I read something related in the Wall Street Journal. That was my one example where I read a Wall Street Journal article and I was like, hey, maybe I can explore something related to that. But I read, I don't think this is going to work. My second asterisk is, there was stories this past week about Google and Facebook moving from the technology index into the communications index. Anybody see this for S&P? And I was like, aha, some exogenous shock. I don't think it's enough. I think they'd have to do lots more companies than the handful of companies that were, maybe there's enough there, but that's something that sometimes you can read newspapers and come up with shocks to things or regulatory change that may be interesting. This is sort of like not just searching for databases, but searching for instruments as well, or shocks to regulation. So that can come from reading the news. And so, but yes, did I apply something from one paper in another context? This portable notion. They only skip the masters. Okay. Fail early and often. I read that somewhere in a different for like startups or something like that. But it definitely, can we view our papers as start? Well, the same idea works for projects. Don't rely on hope. I think too often PhD students just think, I'm going to gather data. I'm downloading data, and there's hope there, and it's almost like you don't want to look at it, because it can only go down. Like the potential for the data is better than the actual results, and they go home feeling good. I gathered more data today, and that is like they accomplished something. Sort of fight that urge to rely on hope. The sooner you can find some analysis, like sometimes there's this feeling that if I gather enough data, my hypothesis will be true. It does not have to work that way. So try to do it quick and see if anything is there, and then build on it. But on the flip side, don't give up too soon. So I have this paper, it's forthcoming in RFS with Tarun, who's a student. And my idea was something that, it looks at macro news and high frequency trading. And my idea exactly was done by Jun Pan and Zhang Wang at MIT. They did my idea. And so when we started working on it, we found that. I was like, well, it was a good idea. They got it in JFE eventually. But Tarun was like, we don't have to give up. We can just sort of push it in a different direction and sort of broaden it and look at other things and try to conclude something else. And so that was all on Tarun. So like I probably would have just given up, but Tarun was like, oh, there's still something here. We'll just sort of push away from them and explore a slightly different question, and it got this forthcoming in RFS. So I know there's some tension here between failing early and don't giving up too soon, and that's something that sort of you can learn about over time, but don't just immediately feel like, oh, there's nothing. Sort of think, what can we learn from this, or can we answer a slightly different question? So I'm echoing what George said about protecting research time. This is, oftentimes it can feel like the residual claimant because it's important, but it's not urgent. The urgent things are the teaching things or the service needs. Like for me, I was area coordinator. Like after I got tenure, I was area coordinator for like 4 years. That had all kinds of busy work associated with it. And I felt like it just took over my life and my research productivity suffered a lot. And it didn't have to, I wasn't good at, separating time for research from the rest of the stuff that happens. And so that was on me for like time management. But I realized after I stopped doing it, how much easier it was to do research again. And so, like now, your favorite word, not favorite word, but an important word is no. And so now when they come to ask me to do service things, I'm always like, no, no, no. And I say yes, every once, I am like the chair of the executive committee now, but it's not as bad, But so just sort of be mindful of that. Know yourself and try to be better at time management. And if you're not like me, then you have to learn to say no, because the school values the research that you do, and so you just have to try to be careful. So, yeah, research is a craft. We sort of think of it as that it's a science, but it's not just a science. There's a craft involved, and so maybe a bad analogy is like making furniture. Like as a PhD student, you learned how to use all the saws, like all the technology, and you feel like once you learn to use the table saw and the radial alarm saw and the band, whatever there are, the router, the plane. Actually, I know some of them, that you must therefore know how to make good furniture, but you do not. There's like an art to it. There's a craft to figuring it out, and you learn from other people who have made furniture before. So and so the same is true for doing research and getting it published. Learn from others. Sometimes when PhD students bring me their thoughts and I read their introduction, they will cite no papers. And I'm like, have you ever seen another introduction that cites no papers? Like, what have you been looking at? And so it's like, learn from others. Notice good introductions and abstracts, sort of like, what was good about that? They motivated that really well. The same for presentations. Whenever I see someone come and present, someone just came from NYU last week. He's Chilean. What is his name? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? He does like
Lieberman.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So Lieberman, he was amazing. He just knew his stuff so well, and he answered questions so well. He knew everything that he was doing. And like after he left, I said to the PhD students, do that. That is sort of like, so notice when people are good and copy those people. Like sort of aspire to be like the good people, both with papers that are well written and presentations that are as good as well. And remember people's names. That's also. Okay, so I'm giving you a couple of be ready with your slides and remember people's names. That is back to how you can own your stuff, is if you remember who the authors are on the papers. So oftentimes PhD students think a paper is the tables. It's like once you form the tables, that the world is just going to look at them closely and discover the nugget of knowledge that you have created there. It does not work like that. You have to motivate it well. You have to nest it in the literature. You have to write it over and over again. And writing is rewriting. So it's not just once and you have done it. It's this iterative process where you take feedback and you make it better and better. This is how it works. And so this is back to the thick skin part. So when you do it, and this is, I had my story that was the don't just redo what somebody else has done on another country. Like sometimes I've read introductions that say, we know about mutual funds, but Australia is important, and we don't know about mutual funds in Australia, and therefore blah, 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 blah. And so, but the paper just confirms what we already knew from the US. That is not impact the paper. We need to emphasize what we learn that is new, not just what you do that is new. And you need to nest it well in the literature to see how, that's one of the first things, since if students come and talk to me about stuff that I don't know already, one of the first things I say is, what's been done? How does this add to what's been done? And so you can't just say, here's what we learned, it has to be what new do we learn? What is already done? Okay, the other thing that PhD students often do is like show me a sprinkling of results. I have this data and I did everything that I could think of. And they want to stick it in there even if it's not related. And so if your paper has a certain question, just include the results that are related to that question. You're often like, but I did it, and I have a table, and so that doesn't mean maybe it could be a separate paper, but don't stick it in there if it just doesn't fit. Because oftentimes that just raises a whole bunch of new questions that you don't address, and so if it doesn't fit, I'm not saying hide things, but if it's just not related, don't include that. Okay, I have like 2 minutes left, 1 minute left. So be open to suggestions and critique. Oh, this is our community right here. This people that we see at conferences, these are our people. I like going to conferences where I see a lot of the same faces over and over again. So think about doing research as being part of this community and not so much like a battle or a chess match or something like that. And that sort of helps you think about that. So seek as much feedback as you can before the submission. And remember, this is like back to the Brad Barber and John. The reader is always right. So if we don't understand something, you can't be like, oh, I put that in footnote 7 on page 13. It's like the reader is right. If the reader missed it, it's because you need to make it more central and make it more clear to us. And so that's sort of one way to think about it. And so don't sort of have this view of like saying, oh, well, you missed it. You misinterpreted what I'm doing. It's our job to make it clear what we're doing. And so sort of don't have this sense of a battle between us and the referee. And so my mantra is, from the referee's perspective, when the referee says something, my mantra is, you're right, and we have changed the paper. Like not in a cynical way, but like in a sort of like a way of remembering how to engage with the referee. And then my last point, well, the second last point, is don't ignore rejections. Like sometimes I have more than once gotten a paper to review for a journal where I've already refereed it for another journal and they did nothing. They didn't change one thing on the paper before. They were just like, well, that was a bad draw. And they'll send it to the next journal and it's like, oh, we got the same bad draw again. And so that doesn't mean you have to do every single thing that the referee says, but just do what you think seems the most relevant, but just don't completely ignore it, because then that reflects poorly on you the next one. So I often say something like, oh, well, maybe they'd want a different referee, but here's what I said the last time. But that just doesn't look so well. It doesn't reflect so well. Okay, so I said that the beginning and the end matters a lot, so I didn't want the end to be end on that. So like, we travel, go to conferences. Like the work that we do, it's maybe used to be you'd have to be on campus next to the big computer, but now you can sort of do most of what we can do for everywhere. So travel, spend someplace interesting and beautiful, like here, and do work in the day, and then go do something fun at night. So it's a great profession. So hope that's